So hi everyone, last week I gave a talk at Singapore Botanic Garden and I said that I would record the session so you could watch it afterwards. However, when I looked back at the video, I wasn't impressed with how it looked because realistically the camera was behind me, so you'd have seen my back and back of my head, and it wasn't the most interesting way of presenting it to you. So I'm going to record it today and then you can basically see my face talking whilst I present the slide deck as well. At the end of the video, I will invite you to make comments and questions down below, and then I'll do a follow-up video in answer to your questions. So let's start with the presentation. I first started engaging with this topic back in 2021, when I was studying for my professional diploma in horticulture with the RHS. I became curious about how new ornamental plants were appearing on the market from tropical countries, but I knew that many of these so-called rare plants were coming from countries facing deforestation. I found myself asking questions like, why were these plants selling for thousands of dollars? Why were plant influencers showing off how much they spent without considering where the plants came from or the conservation issues involved? I remember watching Bretman Rock, a makeup artist influencer, giving a houseplant tour, casually mentioning that one of these plants were extinct in the wild, as it was something to brag about. A term coined plant flexing, very akin to when someone goes on social media and just shows you off how many designer bags they've got and how much they've spent. I was seeing the same thing in the plant world, and it still continues today. Another well-known influencer at the time said, who after going to Thailand said, "We can't know these plants have been poached." I knew this wasn't true. It was around this time I began making reels about Hoyas, which led to discussion with Michele about the conservation and the plant trade. Thanks to my now friend Glenn, the conservation evolved in discussions about the plant trade in Indonesia and how plant hunting and reselling practices were not sustainable. So in 2023, I made a reconnaissance trip to Indonesia with Glenn's help, visiting West Kalimantan and Lampung. This became the foundation of my research, and it's why I feel so integrated in the Indonesian plant trade and working with so many plant hunters. And for those who don't know and who collect Hoyas, the young girl here is Keiko, and that's who Hoya keikowina was named after, and it's a local dialect name. So why is this important? Indonesia's increasing international plant trade, fueled by its diverse flowering plants, is putting increasing pressure on wild population and rainforest habitats. Collectors like to buy plants from different islands from Indonesia, which is called known wild provenance, such as SP Borneo. It's like stamp collecting, or if you think about it, when people buy different shoes from the same collection that all have different colours, different colourways. This is exactly how to say what people are doing in the plant trade. The trade of orchids and nepenthes and cacti and is well known, and consequently are featured on CITES and generally have more funding support. But trade now targets other native flora such as Hoyas, begonias and aroids, creating a research gap. While this booming economy supports rural communities and nurseries, more profits are captured by resellers downstream, are driving overharvesting that is exacerbated by forest degradation. As one plant hunter said to me, if we don't take it, someone else will. Overexploitation reduces genetic diversity, heightening a risk of species unable to survive external environmental pressures. Collectors and sellers increasingly use e-commerce, bypassing traditional regulations, with rare plants sold directly rather than in stores. With limited CITES protections, an updated approach is essential. Hence my analysis of the supply chain from forest to home, with pilot projects. So to give you an idea what my research looks like on a daily basis, I am doing population habitat assessments to assess habitat threats, the population status of these targeted species, sustainability of endemic species across various habitats. That includes primary, that what we call old forest, secondary forests, plantation edges, and conservation zones, and evaluate nursery stock composition, that is wild collected versus propagated material. And I would able to look at the mosses and lichens to identify if that actually is a propagated material. I'm also examining the value chain and market analysis. That's the upstream activities, that's the plant hunter, and downstream, that's resellers and middle persons in the supply chain. Focus on economic drivers, provenance-based pricing, supply chain routes, trade hotspots, and integrating the e-commerce data from phase 1, which I'll show you in a bit, and phase 2, which I'm working on next, to understand current and future market trends. I also want to investigate the social cultural values of nature, to investigate the non-economic drivers of ornamental plant trade amongst plant hunters, resellers, including motivations like wild plants from specific regions and their cultural heritage. And I will talk a little bit more about the values of nature in this talk. I'm also going to develop pilot projects and conservation initiatives. And of course, I'm going to make policy and conservation recommendations. So first, I want to set the scene with you all. How the trade works now. Middlemen, or the term I prefer to use is the term middle person, as not just men are involved in this trade, have played a long-standing role in Indonesia and worldwide, facilitating international buyers across various products, including those related to the animal trade, Chinese traditional medicine, and orchids. However, with every sustainable reseller, there are more involved in monkey business, who give the plant hunters a poor profit. This encourages the plant hunter to take as many as possible from the forest to increase their return, often dropping the plants left to rot. For example, as many as 50 Cytus appendix 1 papapedaliums, that's slipper orchids, may be collected from the wild, but only 2 will survive, as the rest are discarded because they're not deemed good enough by the buyer. Plant hunter is a local term used in Indonesia, and I will discuss later the implications of that term and why I use it in this context. A significant issue is the plant disparity. Despite the critical role the plant hunters and local nurseries play in this plant trade, they receive insufficient compensation from contributions downstream. While nurseries in regions such as Java and Bali resell plants at 3 times the initial purchase price, international resellers often mark prices up 6 times from the original sale, leaving plant hunters with only a minimal share of the profits. This has created an unfair system that highlights the need for reforms within the supply chain to ensure fairer compensation upstream that prevents overharvesting. So I'm going to now move forward to share with you some initial insights from my first year of e-commerce analysis. So, non-traditional markets such as Facebook Marketplace, e-commerce and social media accounts are directly connecting sellers worldwide with plant hunters and small nurseries in remote areas such as Indonesia, increasing direct sales to wild collected plants. These plants often have little time for cultivation as they are harvested directly from the wild. Unlike traditional plant shops or garden centres, sellers use e-commerce sites because they find it easy to bypass regulations, which is why more researchers who focus on wildlife trade have turned to e-commerce. As social media has been shown to drive illegal and unstable harvesting of rare, new described and undescribed species. So my research started in March last year and phase 1 ended in February. I manually collected sales data from e-commerce sites in Indonesia from Shopee, which is all known across Southeast Asia, and Tokopedia, which is an Indonesian company which has over 100 million monthly active users. So it's really popular here. I'm only at the start of my analysis, but I would like to share some initial insights for you today. So I have manually recorded over 6,246 records through cover observation from that which falls under the terms of use of e-commerce sites. That means I'm only reviewing freely available information and not asking the seller for personal information. I'm also not using data scraping software due to ethical concerns because many sellers might not be aware that AI has been used on their site, used on their page. Also, AI tools have been shown to have potential bias. So particularly for my topic, that might actually be a disadvantage to my work. So that's why I do a lot of manual recording and I was doing it on a weekly basis for 52 weeks. So I had the following criteria. It must be native to Indonesia, but can be widespread across the region. So for example, it could be found in Thailand. It had to be a single product listing and not a selection of products like a drop-down menu. Unnamed species, like just no ID, could be recorded. But what I would always do is record those listings and share it with other researchers, and we can talk about buying it or maybe IDing it. I only recorded Dendrodon capra and Phalaenopsis gigantica because these are two examples of two species listed on CITES and have already been marked for conservation concern. The others, like Nepenthes and Hoyas, are recorded all native genre. There were some exclusion criteria. For example, those widespread in cultivation. So for example, Hoya carinosa or Nepenthes alata, which is the monkey cups, because they've been sold in plant shops for a long time. Of course, hybrids. So this is really native species that could be collected from the wild. So as you can see, in April, there was a dip due to Ramadan, but there was a constant level of sales throughout the dry season. Sales began to taper off in September, with noticeably low activity during the rainy season. It could be argued that the slowdown is due to reduced market interest in plants more broadly. However, these patterns also align with seasonal changes, which is why I plan to explore this further in phase 2, to have a more specific species-focused analysis to determine whether low sales are linked to seasonality or decline in overall market demand. What is clear is that Corybus, which is the orange, the reddish orange colour, was listed less frequently. And orchids listings began to slow down from November. However, sales of Hoyas and Nepenthes remained relatively consistent throughout. Just to also share with you the top 20 plants sold by price. So apart from one plant, price dropping, most of these prices stay consistent. So based on this evidence, it's hard for me to agree yet prices are falling. So with my e-commerce, I capture what attributes are being employed to determine sales tactics, conservation status, seller's location, and new species on the market. So from this case example on Tokopedia, the seller is using multiple sales tactics, which is called attributes on a plant label. There you've got AFF, SB Papua, and rare. Attributes recording is a great way to find out about sellers' strategies and finding sources of wild harvested plants. So rarity labels in specialist online consumers have been found to prefer rare plants. So rare labels are seen as a kind of a good marketing tool. Recent described are in high demand and most likely of wild origin. So no ID or AFF. These plants have no correct taxonomic name that may have been wild collected, or the seller has no awareness of the plant species name or knowledge of botany. CF I rarely see on there, so I haven't even recorded that in 1 year. But as I also know that CF is also used quite often as well. Known wild provenance indicates the plant source from the region of origin and usually means wild harvested. Sellers will add provenance to a plant label as collectors like different variation from a different plant, like stamp collecting. Other descriptions such as leaf size and flower colour also recorded. And by recording the location of a seller's shipment location, I can track trade routes and potential sources of wild collected plants. So just to give you an idea, the attributes by type. The high cost of female and male related solely to the Nepenthes veitchi. Most attributes did not raise high prices, with the exception of rare and jungle, seed and seeding labels. And here is a case example of Phalaenopsis gigantica, CITES Appendix 2. I recorded 7 listings of large plants labelled as jungle, which means wild origin, traded from Kalimantan to West Java. I recorded 5 records were sold with SB Kalimantan, native to where it's from, also meaning wild harvested. So how does this look like data analysis? These charts show that plants labelled with Phalaenopsis gigantica jungle, with those resold outside of its native region Kalimantan, tended to experience prices increases when sold in places like Java. This suggests that this reseller may have bought the plant from Kalimantan sellers or paid plant hunters for it. For example, the blue line at the bottom, representing South Kalimantan, shows lower prices compared to the orange and green lines from Java, with the top price reaching over 7 million Indonesian rupiah. The closer to the plant to its source of origin, the lower the price, reflecting its clearly well collected nature. This highlights for plants sold further from the native region, especially with a jungle label, are perceived more valuable, leading to higher prices. And as you can see, the higher price increase in Java were later in the year, represented by the orange lines. So that started around July, and the Kalimantan stuff started in March. So potentially there's a resale there from Kalimantan, and they bought it from Tokopedia, and they decided to resell it on Tokopedia again. I recently learned from going to East Kalimantan that these plants were collected from felled trees. However, this does not take away that Tokopedia lacks policies to remove wild collected plants immediately when it's in violation of CITES and Indonesian trade laws. So what I found out, you could only report animal trade and not plant trade on the site, proving to me that this e-commerce site lacks proper oversight of the plant trade. Another example is Papapedalian Thompson, the slipper orchids. These are CITES Appendix 1. That is the hardest form of trade you can ask for, because this is prohibited for trade unless under exceptional circumstances such as research, and even that, as a researcher myself, is really difficult to transport this type of material to another botanical institution because of CITES. But this native species is native to Sumatra and has been advertised with a provenance in the top picture indicating wild harvested and illegal trade. Similarly, in the bottom picture, this plant without provenance is being sold by sellers in North Sumatra, native to where the species is found, advertised with the photographs in the wild, potentially resold to sellers in Java, like the first listing. This same species was sold by sellers on Shopee without provenance, but a picture of the species in the wild, rather than a picture of a nursery product, which raises suspicions. I used reverse image lookup to discover the picture source. The picture came from a previous listing on another e-commerce company. The seller is based in northern Sumatra. Using reverse image lookup has potentially uncovered the illegal harvesting and supply chain of this species. These findings mirror my recent stock check analysis in West Sulawesi with 2 plant hunters. Notably, species like Papapedalium and the Penthus were all wild collected. The majority of all the other orchid species were wild collected. Hoyas suensiana, 50% of their stock was wild collected and the rest was propagated. That's why I also feel it's important to check nursery stock in person, looking for mosses, lichens and substrate clues that might confirm wild origin. Then I can also check with the resellers downstream, because activities such as removing these mosses and lichens, and then they later can be claimed that they're propagated or even cloned, which is another term that's thrown around the plant market, which for me is using the term clone as a form of like way of saying to sellers this is just a clone material is really dubious, and I'll come on to these terms later on. This alocasia also is being sold with known wild provenance, with ongoing debate whether it represents a new species. But species like alocasia or Hoyas with no ID, with just a provenance label, are pushed in a market as a unique new product. And now as a board member of the International Aerial Society and giving the growing chain of alocasias being sold known wild provenance, and with the complex naming variations, I've decided to now add this to my monitoring. Many of these plants are being sold with only a code or a known wild provenance tag, without proper identification. Yet known wild provenance still helps trace the supply chain and identify potential habitat, especially when plant hunters share the collection origin directly with me, because I know all these plant hunters. These examples show how I use this data not only to request IDs, but also to track how plants move from platforms like Tokopedia. In Mamasa, West Sulawesi, I was able to link plant hunters labeling with online resellers' behavior, showing how these identities may shift downstream to resellers. So for example, they would list this as no ID, and then it gets listed as SP Mamasa later on. So how much does known wild provenance matter on e-commerce? According to my results, the majority are sold without it. However, the most popular is Papua, second is Borneo, if you add up Kalimantan and Sabah as well, and third is Sulawesi. This could be because of the perceptions of these plants coming from deforested areas or because of their perceived rarity value. I will return to this concept later. So how does this look like in price comparison? So as Hoyas are the most logged with known wild provenance, I decided for the first analysis to focus on the top 12. This is a counterfactual analysis where I use the same species without known wild provenance as the counterfactual group and compared those with known wild provenance labels of the same species. What is evident from the prices? What was evident? The prices were similar or in the same price range. However, what I found interesting, species like Imperialis, Latifolia, and Viticulata, known for having a widespread distribution compared to, say, Sulawesiana, were priced higher with known wild provenance. So I thought, let me just focus on wider distribution instead. So what you can see here is Hoya cordata, known wild provenance Sumatra, is priced higher because of the market wanting this value difference. Even though it's not taxonomically significant, it still has a higher price. Another interesting example is Hoya sulawesiana, sold with known wild provenance Indonesia, is sold higher than its true native range, which is Sulawesi, surprise, which I find ridiculous. But this is probably because sellers are trying their luck and doing monkey business. Another one is Hoya viticulata. This is the new kid on the block, which is Wayang in Lampung, sold at higher price. So this is really interesting for me because I've been to this location. I've been stung by a wasp there. I know exactly where this location is. I've seen the plant hunters' entire collection, right? They label the verticulatas different. But they believe that these look different, even though they're not because it's environmental conditions. The collectors even think the same. And when I've said to many collectors, the Wayang is the same as Lampung, I'm still getting pushback and saying they're different. But this is the perceptions of known wild provenance and why it is a value of nature that's influencing the plant trade. And what this demonstrates is known wild provenance is symbolically powerful, even if it's not always reflected in higher prices. At least not yet, and I'm going to come on to this, why I think it could be. This shows that nature is increasingly commodified through narrative rather than through direct e-commerce value. In other words, the story behind the plant matters. Where it's said to come from, its perceived wildness or authenticity matters deeply to buyers. But the symbolic value doesn't always translate to measurable price differences unless the feedback loop between collectors and the trade reinforce it, such as suggesting these new wild forms with known wild provenance is different on what, or the one from this specific location is different from the other island, even when it's just an environmental condition causing it. It doesn't matter to the seller or collector. They want something close to nature, and that's different stamp, and it's a different plant to them, but it's not different to science. What I'm highlighting here is that the perceived authenticity matters, but not in the way that markets typically measure value with known wild provenance. That is exactly why conservation on trade analysis miss these nuances. They focus mostly on economic drivers and they overlook the non-economic cultural values of nature. So what are the values of nature underpinning the plant trade today? I propose the ornamental plant trade is caught in a feedback loop, one that traces its roots back to the era of historical plant explorers and colonial plant hunters. These narratives, whether romanticized or commodified, still shape how plants are valued today. And apparently when I did this presentation in Singapore, they didn't understand what's his name? They didn't understand Spider-Man, that's it. They didn't understand the Spider-Man. But the thing, basically, they're looking at each other with the same thing. And that's basically what a feedback loop is. So we're reflecting each other back on each other. So Frank Kingdon Ward once criticised this obsession, calling it a greedy scramble for new species, both pathetic and vulgar. This fixation on rarity, often at the expense of conservation, continues to dominate the market. This often undermines sustainability. Collectors prioritise rarity and the must-have status or adopt a salvaging mindset, one echoed by institutions. Wild harvested plants are framed as rescued, mirroring ex situ conservation, efforts led by institutions, often unintentionally reinforce a narrative that sidelines or demonises rural communities. These values weren't created by accident. They stem from a deeper history of plant hunting and exploration, have been framed by writers and the media. So let's start with the historical narrative. As a botanist working alongside plant hunters, which is a term commonly used in Indonesia, I have often grappled with the dual nature of this term. For some, it invokes the golden age of exploration with tales of adventures, bringing back exotic flora. For others, it serves as a reminder of the colonial past, criticised for its lasting impact on current practices. Take, for example, this article extract dramatising how he was kidnapped, even when locals are said to avoid these areas because it's too dangerous. This framing reinforces the idea that only wealthy Western explorers are equipped to access and protect these landscapes. This is why, for many, the association between rich Western explorer shapes our understanding of who is best placed to look after these plants. But plant hunting is not a relic. It's an essential for rural livelihoods and plays a pivotal role in conservation, supply chains and the values we place on forest products. But it's often the rural plant hunters that get demonised as a poacher, and the legacy of colonialism lives on. When we look at institutional framing, narratives of plant rescues or discovered or unknown, often not constructed by the scientists themselves, but shaped by institutional media teams and external framing. These narratives can serve a purpose, drawing attention, funding, or symbolic capital, but they also risk distorting the ecological and cultural realities on the ground. For example, in the paper about the underground palm, 2 scientists stated that the underground palm was known in 5 different local languages for a long time. But this was omitted from media framing. Instead, it was stated that the scientists discovered it. In the same way that media frames discovery or unknown, it portrays these forests as wilderness and untouched. Instead, these forests have been used by centuries by local people who have the skills to take care of their forest and their wildlife. Instead, this framing promotes a salvage paradigm coined by James Clifford and used by writers to critique museum collections, erasures of indigenous knowledge and artifacts. Or salvaging, Michael Full and Haiyang Yu, who discuss how salvaging comes from maritime law for recovering valuables from shipwrecks. But applied to environmental salvaging is an oxymoron. Instead, the outside institutions are perceived to have the skills to salvage plants and be safe from local people. In this model, it's not the environment that wins, it's the institution to take the plants home. Salvaging does not engage with in situ, community-based conservation efforts that recognise the resilient nature of both ecosystems and local communities. The plant trade adopts the same language as institutions and demonises local people and buys cheap, wild harvested plants. In my recent article about the role of plant hunters in conservation, I received a comment that included a racial slur, blaming the problem of Southeastern Asian plant hunters. This hasn't surprised me, because underlying that comment is the mindset I've encountered repeatedly in the plant trade. The idea that local or rural people are the bad actors, poaching while those further along the supply chain are innocent or even saviours. That bias is rarely named, but shapes how we think about who deserves to access, trade or protect plants. This is why I want to shift the narrative in the plant trade and conservation through critical reflection on the terminology we use and the values of nature many people hold that increases the overharvesting of species. But many will argue to me that harvesting of these species protects them in areas of high deforestation. I will quote Andreas Fleischmann, a specialist in carnivorous plants. False argument 1. Their natural sites will get destroyed anyway by habitat destruction and climate change. So it's good if these plants will be saved. What Andreas points out is a false argument claimed by plant collectors. For example, Nepenthes cleopatra in the picture here lives on a remote mountain on a conservation area. Its main risk is illegal collection and not habitat destruction. One plant trade in Singapore, interviewed by a well-known plant influencer, called Nepenthes cleopatra functionally extinct. This is another false claim, as this is hard to prove and often misleading due to incomplete data. This has opened the door for more public misinterpretation. especially when narratives are shaped more by drama than by ecological realities, between plant collectors, resellers and plant influencers, who are now just as accountable as institutional framing. Traders and collectors might justify wild harvesting under the guise of rescue. Their actions are salvaging what remains, rather than contributing to further decline. This mindset mirrors institutional tropes of salvaging, where the narrative of loss legitimizes intervention. In doing so, it shifts the discourse away from protection and control of these resources, undermining the local environmental stewardship they pride themselves in, often sidelining local ecological knowledge and potential for in situ conservation. This is especially true for places like Borneo or Papua, where conservation messaging often leans on tropes of danger, remoteness and decline in biodiversity. These ideas are constructed through language, media and conservation narratives, even when on the ground picture is more complex. This shapes collectors' mindsets. As one plant collector said to me after looking on Google Earth, it was deforestation in that area that was the driver of plant loss and not plant hunters. They had totally overlooked where I was working, which is a different area, and I'm studying a range of species habitats. Also, you can look on Google Earth and see a forest, but actually what you're probably looking at is a plantation. So it's not as easy as people think, but however, these values are so strong, they're impacting the plant trade. Another perception is the whole of Sulawesi is being logged. However, where I work in West Sulawesi is not the case. It's unsuitable for plantation because of the montane forest. It's actually local smallholders clearing that makes it easier for pine trees to spread, which is also not being monitored by the local government agencies that's supposed to stop it. So these pine trees are invading and destroying these habitats because they're making the soil too acidic, and the bark is unsuitable for them to grow. In both these cases, an outsider, through perceptions of plant hunters and the forest and using Google Earth, can have a view of what they're doing is not a problem. These values of nature is the feedback loop between institutions, plant collector and community groups, and these actors in the plant trade. It is a value co-creation framework that is beyond economic aspects. These values of co-creation is a reference to a marketing analysis called value co-creation, concept and measurement. As is evident here with this reseller, first they tried to sell it with the Hoya latifolia cinnamon instead, knowing full well if they sell it with latifolia, it would be sold for cheaper. But this didn't work, so a week later they changed the name to glabra with known wild provenance. In the final image, this species is under current taxonomic research, but it's often sold with different known wild provenance, but this seller decided to sell it with red flower. Although these are apparent marketing strategies and economic choices, it's essential to ask why plant hunters and resellers place emphasis on certain attributes like known wild provenance beyond economic choices. While more research exists on the value chain analysis in the animal trade, plant hunters have told me these similar dynamics are in the plant trade. So what are my next steps? So moving forward in May, I will be based in West Kalimantan in Kapuasulu, which is funded by the Scientific Exploration Society, who I won my award for botany and research last year. I will be there for 4 months and I'll be looking at what is the population status and conservation risk of key endemic species like, for example, Hoya undulata, Phalaenopsis and Alocasia species across different habitat types. For example, in Kapuasulu, Hoya undulata, which I know has been overharvested, is one of my species which is endemic there. Another which I helped with transport into the herbarium, which is about to be published, I will be focusing on. So I want to compare newly described species with already described species, giving a unique insight to how trade and conservation threats both in forest and plant trade. How does nursery stock composition compare to wild populations? And what role does species naming, discovery, or misnaming play in harvesting pressures? For example, where a plant is labelled AF or sold with no ID, but can be identified, or when a species moves from being unidentified to being identified, and how that shifts nursery stock and resale value. How do patterns of exportation vary between species range, accessibility, and trade exposure? And what are those conservation implications of provenance disclosure or removal? For example, Alocasia longibolia, can't pronounce that, sorry, is called Westonia or Dove from Kapasalu. The same species is known of Prince of Churup from Sumatra, all because of the varieties of leaf found in nature, even though they're the same species. Another would be Hoya or an orchid found across Indonesia, but more varied, say from Borneo. You actually get that with the moon orchid. It's more prized, I think, from Sumatra than it is from Java. As outlined earlier, I'm analysing the value chain analysis, dynamics, and social cultural values that shape the ornamental plant trade. That obviously includes examining upstream and downstream actors, as well as their activities such as removing lichens or changing the names downstream of the plant. This offers a real focus through interviews and data how value is created and transformed through the value chain. I will be conducting a phase of the e-commerce data with the same species I'm monitoring in nursery stock and in the forest to really look at the supply chain across Indonesia and internationally, and attributes and prices and how they change due to factors such as new taxonomic updates. After completing my fieldwork in West Kalimantan, I will replicate the same approach in West Sulawesi and Lampung in South Sumatra. I'm still on pause in West Papua, but I still want to go there. The aim is to conduct a comparative analysis across different areas with population status, trade dynamics, and conservation risks, while identifying patterns of regional variations that influence sustainability, value perception in the ornamental plant trade across different islands with unique plant endemism. So, for example, Sulawesi is on the Wallacea line. That has its own endemic. Papua has its own endemic flora as well. So these are all priced differently, but also have their own cultural and historical association with the plant trade. Another method I will be doing is pile sorting, because I want to ask plant hunters how and why they group provenance-based plants in this way, such as here, where all these plants had different numbers, but they are not different species. Understanding this is key to building a sustainable pilot projects for phase 2. Of course, I will try and find new species, but also it's important to go backwards when tracking the plant movements. For example, a plant hunter sold 2 species to a collector in Taiwan. One is potentially a new species, but the other one was labelled Hoya, but in fact Oreosparty. Underscoring the need to help plant hunters with their nurseries and IDs, while supporting them access better equal benefit sharing through education. Education is one of my pilot projects for rural farmers. I also want to utilise known wild provenance, like this example here with Hoya undulata. It is prized by collectors, but has been overharvested. I will be drawing from models used by non-timber forest products and the animal trade using traceability schemes. By flipping the association with known wild provenance to a sustainable marker with nursery coding, whilst using metrics adapted from sustainability frameworks and compliance with CITES and international plant trade principles, the hope is to use known wild provenance as an indicator of sustainably sourced that supports fair trade principles that benefits the plant hunters as stewards of their forest. This is benefit sharing. Another idea is to increase seedling stock to supply nurseries. In Java, with ethically sourced diverse plants, seedlings and seeds, In return, plant hunters get a better share of the profit. For example, Indonesian orchid growers import most of the endemic orchid seeds from Thailand. This shows an opportunity to support Indonesian trade networks to grow native plants domestically and support reintroduction programs. It also increases the diversity of tissue culture plants. And the reason why I think this is a really strong idea is because I understand the local nurseries across Indonesia and their ability to upscale. It might be the most simple way at this point to work with this kind of model, and later on work with the plant hunters down the line in building a nursery to sell directly to international sellers. Because I understand how the system works here, and you just have to work with what you can do and the raw nature of these communities. The horticultural trade, working with existing forest management, agroforestry and plantations, is a way to preserve these plants but to increase their economic and cultural capital. My hope is this may increase forest protection and support ecotourism. For example, one of the plant hunters I know in West Kalimantan already knows that orchids and Hoyas are growing in all palm plantations. We could work with that system already. And these ideas are built from existing community involvement. I also have a live choice experiment running to explore how collectors rank plants on attributes like known wild provenance or visual cues like variegation. This experiment may provide further evidence alongside existing studies that known wild provenance labelled plants are perceived as a premium, which could support sustainable sourcing models and reinforce the pilot projects I'm developing. So you can also follow me on YouTube, which I'm on now, and then on the right is my Instagram handle. If you haven't followed me, please do. It's where I will share directly with plant hunters and themselves and more about what I'm doing in the field going forward, especially in West Kalimantan. So here in the talk is where I open in Q&A. And now I'm going to turn it to you. So please make a comment below or ask a question in the comments below section. And I will do a follow-up video and respond to these questions or comments. So thanks for listening if you made it this far. And please do follow me and like and share with all your friends. Because I think this needs to be shared more in the plant community. And I want to make more people aware about the sustainability issues and the potential solutions going forward. Cheers.